Well, thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the launch event in celebration of the Health and Human Rights Oral History Project. It is so wonderful to see you all here, including more than a few familiar faces. My name is Michel Duvivier Pierre-Louis, and I am the president and founder of FOCAL, the Foundation for Connaissance et Liberté in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Foundation for Knowledge and Freedom. It is such a pleasure, and I'm honored to be opening this event. Today, we are gathering to celebrate an incredible initiative that captures the stories, lessons, emotion, successes, losses, and triumphs of decades of work in global health. This archive of oral histories pulls back the curtain and reveals the hidden history behind some of the most significant development in the field of health and human rights over the past 30 years. A large majority of these stories trace back to Open Society's former public health program. When Jonathan Cohen asked me to participate in this oral history project by giving a 3-hour interview, I immediately said yes. You see, our relationship between FOCAL and the Open Society Public Health Program was never about money. It was about values. It was never about demeaning people with charity. It was about empowering them with dignity. From the moment we started FOCAL, everything was about health. Our work with peasant farmers, with women's movement, on education and nutrition, and on public infrastructure, all of this work was about creating the condition in which the people of Haiti could enjoy health and well-being. For me, our work in public health has always been about dignity. Since the beginning of FOCAL, we have been asking ourselves, how do you enfranchise people who have been disenfranchised for so long? When I look at the contributions of my fellow oral historians in this collection, I see these exact questions reflected in their work as well. I want to acknowledge the role of the Open Society Foundations in making this project possible. Not only did they provide financial support for the Oral History Archive to come into being, but they entrusted this task to the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at the University of Southern California. They have done a marvelous job. These next 90 minutes, you are in for a treat. We have an incredible cast lined up for what that will not only leave you excited about this archive, but about the potential and possibility of oral history and storytelling for all of us and our work. Thank you so much.
I got a call from the network of people living with HIV saying there are 3 gentlemen who have been arrested who are members of their network for not adhering to TB treatment. At that time, Kellen purely worked on HIV, legal work, providing legal advice, but they called and said, we have no one else to turn to.
The greatest inequity that we identified, among others, was this lack of available oral morphine.
We supported these people to be at the table in discussions about mental health policy, about mental health financing.
This became a project that then allowed us to start shaping our work around TB, because as we dealt with that case, we found more cases springing in different towns, in different areas.
It wasn't that there were large numbers of people against doing something different. There was, people didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what would work differently, and they didn't know that oral morphine could be substituted, and they didn't know that they could escalate these oral doses of drugs.
Welcome, one and all, and thank you, Michelle, for honoring us by opening today's event. I'm Jonathan Cohen, and I'm a clinical professor and director of policy engagement with the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at the University of Southern California. I also spent 16 years with the public health program of the Open Society Foundations, first as the director of the program's Law and Health Initiative, and then as the program's deputy director, and finally as its director from 2016 to 2021. During that time, all of us who worked for and with the PHP came to see human rights not just as a normative framework for better understanding health outcomes and holding duty bearers accountable, but also as a set of tools, tactics, demands, programs, and movements that we in philanthropy could put money behind. And that we did, with great gusto, love, and devotion to the cause, always guided by our local partners in the national and regional foundations of the network, and always inspired by the belief that George Soros, the philanthropist, could reap the greatest social return for George Soros, the investor, if we intervened not in the clinical, biomedical, and scientific underpinnings of health, but at the social, economic, political, and systems level. This is a story worth telling. It is also a story worth preserving for history, so that generations of philanthropists, practitioners, advocates, researchers, and students might learn from it and continue telling it. In a moment, you'll get to hear from a few more voices that contributed to the incredible collection of oral histories that we are launching today. We'll leave a few minutes at the end of the event for questions, and we hope that following the event, you'll check out the archive itself, which we will share some more previews of shortly. We encourage you to make use of the chat throughout the event, not only for questions, but to reconnect with old friends, to share ideas, and to lift up the speakers and those who generously gave of their time in contributing an oral history to this pilot collection. Thank you, and let's roll the first clip.
So the reason why we were let into the Russian prison system at all wasn't because the prison people cared about the prisoners. What they cared about was the staff. So what was happening in the Russian prison system is that because it is a transmissible disease, the staff in these prisons were getting sick and dying of tuberculosis, both drug susceptible and drug resistant tuberculosis. So that meant that the Minister of Justice, sort of like a win for the prison reform people, because we were all in the Russian prisons. I went to these Russian prisons in the middle of Tomsk, like closed. The Ministry of Justice was into it because they didn't want to see their prison staff die, and the human rights people were into it because we were actually treating prisoners.
All right. My name is Asna Tabasum, and I am a student at the University of Southern California. I had the privilege of interviewing Nina Schwalbe for the Health and Human Rights Oral History Project. Nina, I have a few questions for you today. The first being, why did you agree to participate in the project?
Well, thanks, Asna, and you're an excellent interviewer. I want to acknowledge what a great pleasure it was to speak with you. So I really think oral history is an underutilized tool to capture the qualitative information and other viewpoints that become the dominant narrative. The Soros Foundation, as Jonathan said, played a major role in driving the equity agenda. And I wanted to make sure we conveyed also the beginning of the story of the public health programs, which actually had a predecessor in the medical and health programs. I'm super proud to have been part of an organization that led the way on equity, country-led decision-making, inclusion of civil society, and equitable access, and share a path that was not always easy. There's so many stories people don't know, and this was an opportunity to reflect on seeds planted in the early years. Also because Jonathan asked me, so we're bookends on the public health program.
Amazing. And what do you think people will learn from your oral history that they can't learn from existing public sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very little of the work done by the program is captured in any regular history books or even the dominant narrative. And Mr. Soros was not a big believer in program evaluation and still may not be. He sort of said, if it's working, we'll know, and if it's not, we'll know. So these interviews share some of the stories behind the story and what we call the sausage making. I hope it will also serve to drive a new set of questions about drivers of change, work behind the scenes, and maybe help us reflect critically on decisions that were made in the past and how that affects the present and the future.
Amazing. And how do you see oral history as being important to the field of global health?
History helps us think about the present with a level of humility. Oral history is particularly important because it drives an understanding of the contextual factors that led to events and decisions at the time. It adds a level of richness we don't get from reading Lancet articles or looking at the data.
Very fair. And I'm curious about what you might have personally learned from participating in the process.
First, I learned I don't have a very good memory and should take much better notes. And, also somebody told me years ago I should keep a diary, which I didn't do at the time. And I reflect everybody on this call just to write down a few notes of what happens every day. For me, it was really empowering, working at the foundation in those early years and convincing them that public health is important. Kathy was there, Bob Lawrence, other people, Kasia, other people are on the phone here that remember those days. So it was actually kind of an empowering opportunity to look back on the past and really reflect on what we accomplished. I don't think we do that enough.
Amazing. I think I will have to go buy a diary after this call. All right. Thank you so much, Nina. It was a pleasure to interview you and a pleasure to speak with you. And I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you, Asna. That was great.
The world has changed. And I think it's really brought to light a whole new attitude in the global public health sphere. People are talking about decolonizing global health. Our institutions, whether they be the World Health Organization or UNITAID or whatever, who make these big decisions based on global north market forces. It's time to change that. Who's the leadership? Who's speaking? Who's being listened to? Who are the experts? All this is on the table now.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Taher.
Hi, Lily. Good to speak to you again.
Speak to you. So hi, everyone. My name is Lily Guo, and I am a recent soon-to-be graduate of USC. And I had the privilege of participating in the oral history project, and one of the most incredible interviews I had was with Taher Alman, who's the co-founder and co-executive director of the Initiatives for Medicine Access and Knowledge, IMAC, along with his co-founder Preeti. So yeah, I'm really excited to ask you some questions. How are you feeling?
Great, Lily. I mean, I have a fond memory of the 3 and bit hours that we spent together. You asked me some questions that really caught me off guard because it's not often we get to sort of dig into our past, and it's a good reminder from Nina to say keep a note of what you do over these years of work. So yeah, I look forward to digging back into it.
You said something that I want to just ask really quickly. What was the most surprising thing or the thing that caught you off guard the most?
So I did a little bit of my homework. I went back through your questions from the transcript, and the question that really flummoxed me, and just goes to show how we just are constantly just moving, was what was the first thought or emotion you had when you were asked to do this oral history? Because that kind of stumped me. And I think my response was that, wow, we don't often get to reflect. And so just even thinking about the emotions of your work over a period of 20 years nearly, it really sort of, one has to really sort of go into the sort of vaults to really remember things that you've done, because we're just constantly just doing. So I really appreciated this opportunity through this project to really go back and relive and rethink all the things that have happened over this period of time. So I'm grateful that you really gave me a question about something that's about my emotions and feelings. Probably not my best place.
Yeah, I think that emotions were definitely something that we wanted to touch on in this oral history project. And I'm sure that the feeling of not being able to sit and reflect is something that a lot of people on this call can relate to. So great. I have a kind of longer question for you, though, about the global movement for access to medicines, which you are intimately involved in. It's attracted so much public attention with COVID-19, multiple scandals within the pharmaceutical industry. So what hidden or neglected aspects of this movement were you able to bring to light with your oral history?
I think, first of all, it was an opportunity because a lot of people, maybe many people, of engaging with the whole issue of access to medicines and the inequitable distribution of vaccines that has happened over the last few years. And so what this oral history was an opportunity to really showcase this is an issue that has been going on for at least 20, 25 years. And for the, even beyond, before I even got involved in this work, and that there have been many chapters that have come along the way in trying to resolve these issues, and also to shed light on institutions which kind of may seem like they've been around for a long time, but actually are just as old as Justin Bieber, like the World Trade Organization. People forget that. People think that, oh, this is something that's kind of like the 10 Commandments that we have to accept, like intellectual property rules. No, they're recent. These are new phenomena in terms of global public health. And the other opportunity was to kind of speak about that history and speak about the beginnings and the origins of that, and helping people connect the dots so that basically people who are new to this discussion and new to this debate understand that there's this ongoing continuum of activism and social movements that have kind of grown over the period of the last 20 years. And, looking at the sort of pitfalls and where we've failed, where we've actually made progress, I think this is a significant opportunity to really leave a record for what I believe is the next generation. I've been doing this work, and my co-founder has been doing it for 16 years. It doesn't stop with us. This oral history is a great marker for the next generation who wants to get involved in these issues and to learn and to see where we made progress, where we didn't, and what we can do differently.
You bring up a really good point, and it's something that we actually touched on in another oral history with Rebecca Cook, which is a lot of things, rights, connecting health and rights feel like a given to the younger generation. Do you think that's part of why it's so important to record these oral histories for the younger generations?
Absolutely. We are essentially passing the baton to them. And I think having this record, I think COVID in itself there's going to be revisionism that's going to go on. There's going to be people, the media's already twisted the stories to be like, oh, well, there was some great sort of results of the WTO and so many donations happened and what have you. It's our job, to really record the history for particularly people who are active in the global public health space, who want to become active, to understand that actually there's a different history. And I think this has always happened in any walk of any issue, any political issue. And I think it's important for us to share these stories so that they're not sort of whitewashed and forgotten about, and so that people can actually move forward. And I think ultimately, the other thing is also what I didn't say in my other question is the issue of colonialism in public health. This is something that when I started this work, I remember an activist in India when I was living in India said, oh, we're being recolonized by the World Trade Organization. And most people kind of thought, that's tough language. That's kind of, we moved on for colonialism. But here we are today, 20 years on, and that's the language that's now being rebirthed. And so I think it's important to kind of connect that history to what's happening now.
100%. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So in your ideal world, what will people take away from your oral history?
That it takes a lot of perseverance to move the needle, even just a small little bit. that it takes a lot of different actors, that it takes a lot of commitment, that it doesn't always mean that that every victory should be savored. You're not going to change the world overnight. I remember when I got involved in political issues, somebody once said to me that there's always going to be some conflict. So don't worry if you can't actually work on this particular one, there's always going to be another one. I know that sounds pretty dark, but it's true. But also that the machine or the system is so big and so great that even if you're able to put enough sand in it so that it has to change direction is a victory. And these are the things that I think I've learned over the last 15, 20 years. And I think what we're seeing now is with the new generation, at least the ones I've spoken to, they're more committed to structural change. I think the last 20 years we have unfortunately, and I'm a child of neoliberalism, we have unfortunately fostered neoliberal policies and solutions. And I think the next generation has an opportunity to break from those chains and actually reimagine a different world.
Thank you for that. Well, it was a pleasure interviewing you, and it was a pleasure talking again now. I'll pass it on. I think we have another video. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily.
It's a strange thing to say HIV presented this opportunity to our community, but people didn't care about us before we became a threat to them. The fact that we were criminalized, the fact that we had serial murderers in nearly every country killing our community, the fact that police were the primary perpetrators of violence against us, extorted us for money and sex. All of these things were tolerated within many of our societies. And it was only when we became a threat to public health, as people perceived us, that suddenly people started to pay attention to us.
Wow. Hi, Ruth. So happy to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Everyone, my name is Mylise Basturk, and I'm a second-year medical student at the Keck School of Medicine, and I had the honor of interviewing Ruth Morgan Thomas for the Health and Human Rights Oral History Project. Just a little bit on, why I chose to speak with Ruth a little further for this event. It's because when I was looking back on the transcripts, reflecting, on the whole body of work I did for the oral history, every time Ruth spoke, I would just respond with, wow. I couldn't say anything else. I was just at a loss of words. And I think it's because I was in awe. I was inspired by your fighting spirit, Ruth. And I saw a little bit of who I wanted to be when I grew up. So thank you for sharing your story. And just to reflect a little bit further, I wanted to ask, Open Society was a major supporter for the sex worker rights movement for many years. What do you want people to learn most from your oral history?
I suppose I'm going to start with how essential such philanthropic support was in enabling us to realize a global sex worker movement that had influence and the potential impact, which is huge on our health, our well-being, but also our human rights. So I think that initially, people haven't always considered that we as sex workers would have the same rights as other people, the right to work, the right to privacy, the right to family life, things that our community are denied so often. And what this has shown, the funding, the support that we've had has shown, is that we can mobilize, we can create a global movement. We have member organizations in over 101 countries, sex worker-led groups, who are fighting on the ground for their rights now and for their right to health as well. And I think that it also, I hope what people will learn from the oral history that they listen to is the importance of the structural barriers, criminalization, the systemic discrimination that our community experiences, how we are disproportionately impacted by poor health outcomes, by violence, in a way that it isn't us that are risk takers, it is society that excludes us from rights and opportunities that create our vulnerability. And that applies across female, male, trans, and gender diverse sex workers in all our diversity. We intersect with so many marginalized and criminalized communities. All of us are impacted by those structural barriers. And I hope people will begin to understand the impact that that has on our health and our human rights.
Thank you. What did you enjoy most about being a part of this project?
I think similar to everybody else, the opportunity to reflect. We are always so busy responding to various situations that emerge, urgent or not, that we rarely get time to sit back and think about where we started. And one of the things that the interview surprisingly took me back to was when I started activism for sex worker rights before I became a sex worker, when I was 17. Now that's 45 years ago. And it's been a long time since I went back to those roots of where I started and how I have grown through that time. And it helped me reflect on what we've actually achieved, because we have so far to go as a sex worker movement. And yet there was a sense of fulfillment at the end of it about saying, oh, no, we have achieved things. We've achieved WHO having a recommendation that governments should work towards decriminalizing sex work as part of a public health response.
Yeah.
And so that gave me immense sense of fulfillment. And I thank you for helping me on that journey.
So was there anything that was really challenging?
I think we talked a little bit about it in the conversation that we had. I think it's always difficult when you are an activist who also challenges the people that give you money. And we have had a history of challenging OSF sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think it's always that talking about it is quite challenging, because you quite often wonder whether or not you're doing the right thing or not. But I believe that honesty and forthrightness actually will serve history well, in terms of we have to be honest about the problems as well as the successes.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay. And how would you hope your oral history might be used in the future? Who do you think might be using it?
I don't know. I hope it reaches a really wide audience beyond people in global health, beyond people in public health. Because I think what we did together was map out the path that the support from OSF, but also from others, has allowed the sex worker movement to develop and grow. And I'm hoping that we can share the link across the movement as well to the oral history, so that actually people can see, because everybody that's spoken were right. We don't document the details that we talk about when we have conversations with one another. And I think there's a huge richness across the whole of the archive in the oral history and the activism that has tried to influence the equity in health, if you like.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Ruth. It was truly a pleasure to get to know you and your story. And yeah, thank you so much for all the work that you gave to this project.
Thank you, Elise. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
So I must say that I think, like many of you, watching this profound intergenerational interaction between the students who did these interviews and the interviewees, the mutual respect and reverence, knowing that these students, Asna, Lily, Mylise, held the container for the stories, for the oral histories, it's profoundly moving to me, and I'm sure for all of you. And I just want to thank you. I want to thank you, Nina, Ruth, Tahir, for showing all of us a window into your oral histories and what it was like to participate in this process. And I want to thank Lily, Mylise, and Asna for bringing your amazing interview hats to this event. I think you could all catch a glimpse of what incredible interviewers they are. We wanted to, at this point in the program, share a few visuals from the archive to show you all the final product, which I encourage you to look at, of course, in your own time after the event today. So this first slide here shows the landing page for the collection in the University of Southern California Digital Library. Since the spring, we've been working closely with the USC libraries, including our library colleagues who have archiving and oral history expertise, to craft a permanent home for the Health and Human Rights Oral History Project. The pilot archive contains over 90 hours of footage in the form of recorded oral histories, as well as their associated archive quality transcripts, and in some cases, photographs that our interviewees supplied as well. And in the next slide, you can see an example folder. So this is the folder for the oral history of Umanyana Rujeje from South Africa, from section 27. On this landing page, for instance, you could watch Umanyana's 3-hour video. You could look at her transcript. You could read an overview of her work and what is discussed in the interview. As you can see from the next slide, all of the oral histories have been tagged with metadata that allow you to search for different keywords, people, and places, which offer different results from the archive. So for example, you could enter access to medicines, and all of our oral histories that touch upon that topic would be displayed. You could enter tuberculosis, you could enter Latin America, and that would display all of the oral histories on those different topics. In the next slide, we want to share a different resource. So the USC Digital Library Archive, while the permanent home for the oral histories is not the only way to access the interviews, we also have this YouTube channel, which we have been regularly, adding highlight videos to. So the videos on the YouTube channel are 8 to 10 minutes edited videos from the 3-hour oral histories, which give you kind of an exciting glimpse into each one. I definitely encourage you to check these out, to go to the YouTube playlist. It's really fun to browse around, and it can give you kind of a quick glimpse into all of the different interviews and who's in them. Next, there is a project page on the website of our Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at the University of Southern California. So this provides still another entry point into the pilot archive, and it links through to the USC Digital Library. And this is just a different, very user-friendly way of seeing the interviewees alongside one another. As you can see here, we also conducted kind of mini oral histories with our student interviewers, giving their own oral histories of what it was like to participate in this project. So we will, at the end of this event, pull up a QR code so that you can all begin to discover the archive. You can look at the USDL site, the YouTube playlist, the Institute website, and use and play around with the links, see what's in there, circulate them among your networks. And with that, it's my pleasure to transition us into the next segment of our program, in which we will discuss the future of this collection in the company of 3 very distinguished scholars and educators who we will highlight for you now. So we are extremely proud that a project that really began as a legacy project for the public health program at the Open Society Foundations, which was funded by Open Society, has grown into a partnership with the University of the Witwatersrand to critically analyze this collection with a view towards incentivizing its utilization in scholarship, teaching, and activism, as well as the expansion of the collection over time. And we can't think of a better partner for what will become really the principal phase of this project than Wits University, which has led its own pioneering health and human rights work in South Africa, which is home to the Wits History Workshop, which promotes the use of oral history to capture the lives and experiences of those who are erased from traditional historical inquiry, and which is also a member of the Open Society University Network. And joining us from Wits today is Professor Noor Niftegoden, welcome Noor, who is the head of the History Workshop. Noor is also the NRF South African Research Chair in Local Histories and Present Realities, and a lecturer in history at Wits. He has published articles and book chapters on aspects of popular insurgent struggles, public history, youth politics, and local history. And he serves on the boards of the South African History Archives, the Alternative Information and Development Center, and the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, as well as the journal African Studies. Joining Noor for this conversation are Tamar Ezer and Leon Botstein. Tamar Ezer is the acting director and a lecturer in law with the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami and the faculty director of their human rights program. In addition to her distinguished career in clinical legal education at Yale, Georgetown, Tulane, and University of Miami, Tamar spent many years with the Open Society Public Health Program. She was deputy director of the program's Law and Health Initiative, where she focused on legal advocacy to advance health and human rights in Eastern and Southern Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Welcome, Tamar. And last but not least, Leon Botstein is the president of Bard College, and also an internationally acclaimed conductor and music director of the American Symphony Orchestra, and a longtime global board member of the Open Society Foundations, of course, during the time of George Soros's 3 decades of philanthropy and public health. Botstein has devoted his life and work to the improvement of people's lives through education and exposure to the arts. Under his leadership, Bard College has developed into a distinctive liberal arts institution, and Leon has established and nurtured programs such as the Bard Music Festival, the acclaimed Prison Initiative, which offers degrees to prisoners and which has become a model for prisons across the United States, and Bard's High School Early Colleges, which is a growing national movement. Leon also serves as chairperson of the board of the Central European University and as chancellor of the Open Society University Network. So we really couldn't ask for a better panel of scholars, educators, cultural influencers to discuss the utilization, the expansion, the future of this archive. And we have about 30 minutes for discussion with you. And what I'd like to do is just start with a single question for all 3 of you, and maybe we can go in the order in which you were introduced. So Noor and Tamar and Leon. And my first question is simply, what value to historical inquiry do you think an oral history collection of this nature, whose first phase focuses on George Soros's contributions to the field of public health, what value do you think this can contribute to historical inquiry? Noor, let's start with you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and I'm very excited to be part of this fabulous launch event. I'm, of course, drawing on my experience as an oral historian in South Africa, where oral history played a critical role in unearthing hidden histories and placing subalterns at the center of historical inquiry. And it seems to me that is probably the first point that one wants to make about the value of oral history. Is that it challenges the erasures of various populations from dominant narratives, And it seems to me in this collection that covers the stories, the experiences of activists in public health, certainly in the field of history. This is a profoundly underrepresented field, and there's no better way of challenging those erasures than through oral history. Thanks.
Thank you, Noor. Tamar.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody and really to reconnect. This is such an amazing community. So thank you for bringing us together. Just to add, I think the last decade or two in health and human rights have really been pivotal. This field has really blossomed and taken off. And I think Open Society Foundations was really very privileged to be part of that and to help contribute to that. So capturing some of those stories is so really special and so important. And there's so many lessons for us. And I'll also say, I think for Open Society Foundations, what I loved about working there is that you oftentimes had a bird's eye view and that you could see, movements and people across issues, across different countries and geographic regions and bring them together. And so this oral history is not just a history of individuals, but also a history of movements and how they intersect and work together. And I think also what was unique about Open Society Foundations is that it oftentimes served as a kind of convener that would then spark innovation. So that would be in cases like, bring together lawyers, amazing lawyers that are working on trans issues, sex worker groups, with people who use drugs, different parts of the world, Kenya, Ukraine, Denmark, bring them together and see what happens. Bring together communities, healthcare providers, and lawyers who are working on HIV issues, palliative care, harm reduction, and start to integrate this legal support into healthcare settings. And can the law be a source of healing? What does that look like? And can you get not just medicine, but also support for addressing violence, discrimination, security, stability? So things like that. And this oral history provides an opportunity to delve in some of these issues further. And as the previous speaker said, we're so oftentimes, moving and in motion. So this opportunity to just take a step back, be still and reflect is all too precious. And also to celebrate, like look at the challenges, but also to celebrate the accomplishments is so precious.
Thank you, Tamar. And, speaking of bird's eye view, Leon, you had a bird's eye view of all of George Soros's philanthropy. What value to history do you think a collection like this could bring or not bring?
Well, it's very nice for you to have me. As you said, I'm not, I wasn't directly involved in the field, but it seems to me just common sense would say that people telling stories with their voice insert detail that they might actually edit out of a printed record. That there is an improvisatory aspect and spontaneous ability in an oral history to interrupt, to follow up, where the reaction of the reader, so to speak, or the listener is anticipated. And so you get a different kind of detail. I think so for historians, or anybody wanting to sort of understand how decisions are made and what happened and the nature of philanthropy, capturing as you say, the storytelling in an oral history format is gives something that you couldn't get by reading it. And the other thing is the tone of voice. The great thing about an oral history is that language is not a static, standardized instrument of communication. And so the gestural, tonal quality of the way someone says something tells you a lot that you might not infer from a printed document. And so, and then also the interesting about oral histories is that they are they're timed, they're at a certain moment. And so people misremember, they romanticize, they use the opportunity to tell a story to embellish it, to justify it in retrospect. And so the oral history becomes a document for future historians and people to test other kinds of claims that are in print, that are journalistic, that are analytical, that are in print. So oral histories are hugely significant documents, and people have less and less patience in a way. I mean, people write blogs and you know, and the technology has made writing easier, but it doesn't. And since now writing can be dictated, in other words, oral transcription, there's still something about the presence of an interviewer, which is also very interesting because it does help frame what the people say. So it's one thing to talk narcissistically into a tape or by yourself writing, but somebody who is, as in many cases here, not of the same generation, they drive the discussion, and the miscommunication or levels of curiosity or different areas of curiosity become revealing to the listener. So I just think it's something that is like the project you ran, Jonathan, that is interventionist, crosses cultural and physical boundaries. This kind of oral documentation, it seems to be, you know, an essential component to figuring out, you know, what actually happened.
Thank you, Leon. And I can think of countless of moments in this 90 hours that exemplify the kind of unscripted, improvisational, thrown off guard quality that you're describing, and hope there will be time at the end for our student interviewers and interviewees and others to react to your portrayal, your excellent portrayal of the meaning of oral history. Let me ask each of you a specific question. Tamar, I'd like to start with you if I could. How might you see utilizing a collection like this in clinical legal education, which really sits at the intersection of theory and practice?
Yeah, and I know that when you first mentioned this idea, Jonathan, I was immediately excited and said, when is this happening? I would love to integrate something like this in teaching. So as mentioned, I teach in the Human Rights Clinic, and students work on cases and on projects, but also have an opportunity to reflect and take lessons and ideas and really think a little bit about theory of change. And I think history is so crucial to social change, being able to take a look at challenges, successes, and lessons. And also this intersection, I think what's really special about this history is the intersection between social movements and law and lawyers, and being able to think about lessons for lawyers and partnering with social movements, I think will be really helpful and really useful to the students. And then also, as said, so oftentimes we take the world we're in at a given moment as a given, as it's always been there. And it's really important to actually challenge that and question that. And history has a way of broadening your imagination and seeing that there were the people behind that, and there were other possibilities, and it arrived at a certain place. And also, we're so oftentimes focused on our present challenges and difficulties. And the history also captures resistance and victories. You know, as Tahir said, sometimes, you know, the challenges are so monumentous. So capturing some of those small victories is, I think, really, really special and really important for the students, and really inspiring for the work that they're doing. So that's one area. And then secondly, I think that oral history also has some wisdom about human rights itself. It shows how it is dynamic and developing. It's not just a set of laws and documents, but the people and the stories behind it, and how it has changed and evolved, and the struggle to make that happen. All of that is captured, and also some of the core principles, because you see stories that span different issues and very different settings, but the core principles of human dignity, human agency, having affected communities front and center when it comes to decision-making and policy shines through in all of them. And that is, I think, really also really important. And then lastly, on specific issues. So sometimes we work on issues like harm reduction, or we could work on access to medicines, and getting some of those stories about those particular issues and both kind of the reflections, but also the history is so important. And I just want to share Sarah's. I was watching Sarah's history, and she was talking about safe injection sites, which I know is controversial in many circles, but the way she spoke about it so beautifully, about a right to exist, and not just for the drugs, but for people, a right to have a place, a right to be, a right to take up space. And I think it was just so powerful. So having those kinds of nuggets of wisdom to share with the students is really great.
Yes, and I believe she even said that a human rights lawyer might not agree with her analysis of that right, but it sounds like you're one human rights lawyer who does agree with her. Noor, let me come to you, because as much as people like Tamar and many others have wonderful ideas for how to use this collection, we do want to be humble about the fact that it won't automatically be useful, right? That there are certain circumstances under which oral history is useful in pedagogy, in scholarship, in activism. What do you think those circumstances are? And not having been part of the creation of this pilot collection, but being part of its future, what will you be looking for in this collection to gauge whether it can live up to its potential as something useful for scholarship and teaching and activism?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jonathan. Look, I think that one needs to draw on quite a long-standing debate, at least within the discipline of history, around the value of oral history. And I think that what the interviews that are already on the site attest to is the ways in which the experiences of activist scholars, advocates for human rights, have told their stories. And it seems to me, when one thinks about the circumstances in South Africa, oral history really made a significant contribution in circumstances of adversity. And I think that one, I'm probably the odd person out in this kind of webinar, as someone who's not directly involved in kind of public health, either as a scholar or as an activist. But I would say that internationally, that public health is under siege, from kind of various quarters. And oral history, which has as one of its central values, placing the experiences of ordinary people, and I put that in inverted commas, who do extraordinary things in building movements, allows us better to understand how those movements are built. And I want to say that oral history is not simply about adding color, adding embellishments to knowledge production. Oral history is principally, at its best, a process of co-production of knowledge. And it's not only about adding color to the more kind of authoritative pieces of knowledge, meaning written documentation. So I'm urging that one takes the oral testimonies as seriously as outcomes of knowledge production as one would a journal article, and not imagine that it plays a secondary role only as potentially a primary source, but take seriously what happens in the interview. And so from a pedagogical standpoint, this is what I hope will be elaborated in the kind of pilot project. It is the potential of democratizing the process of knowledge production that is really interesting. While one is fully aware of the asymmetries of power that may exist within an interview, depending on who the interviewer and interviewees are. But it's that potential which I think that one can realize. And I, for example, was very struck. I dipped into the archive, and there may be more, but I saw one interview with an interviewer. And that suggests to me the potential of kind of really thinking in very interesting ways about the methodology, about allowing an interviewer to reflect on her or his ways of engaging, of seeing this as a process of knowledge production. The archive that has been produced, that is already in but I think everyone here said that it's an archive also of the future, which is about informing activism. And I was struck by, in the one or two interviews that I did in, that advocacy, in this case, public health and human rights, as it is about advocacy and social movements elsewhere, often history is about the interface between those movements and power, be it pharmaceutical companies or states, but very rarely about what goes on in those movements. And what oral history is able to do more than other methodologies is give one a sense of the making of movements, of the decision-making process, of discussions, of the debates, of the interactions, of the disagreements, of the fallouts, of the divisions, all of those things, including the affective dimensions which were presented earlier, gives one a much better understanding and the reflections on the making of movements. And I think if one is talking about handing over the baton in an intergenerational sense, it is creating that institutional memory of movements in order to allow new movements to learn from those, in order better to create movements as they engage in advocacy and also engage in various powers. And I think that here's a possibility of making those connections in ways that typically does not happen if one has exclusive oral history separated from advocacy and movement. And here one has a very powerful interconnectedness between those different dimensions. Thanks.
Thank you, Noor. So we've talked a lot about oral history. We've talked about public health and human rights, and I want to talk a bit more about philanthropy in this context. We are, of course, with this collection celebrating and recording the philanthropy of George Soros, which is known for many things, perhaps not best known for its work in public health. And in that sense, I think we're helping to write a new chapter of the history of philanthropy, as well as a new chapter of the history of public health. Leon, I wanted to come back to you and ask, as someone who, as you said, doesn't work directly in the public health field, but spans so many disciplines, from what you were able to glean about George Soros's philanthropy in public health over decades of being in an oversight and a governance role in the foundation, and from your multidisciplinary vantage point, what do you think that future scholars and generations of students studying different disciplines might have to usefully learn from George's contributions to the field of public health?
It's a very it's a provocative question. Let me say first to the last speaker, I by no means wanted to imply a secondary position to oral histories in promoting understanding, but the mediums of an interview or oral history and that of print are different. Not one is not superior or inferior. They work together. You can do things with print you can't do with oral histories, and there's something you can do with the oral history and find out and glean that you can't from print. So I don't want to, I think you're absolutely right. There's no reason to debate any kind of priority issue. They especially are essential, especially since in contemporary life, the video, the visual, and the auditory have a huge place and priority in the way that people fashion their understanding of the world. And reading, for that reason, and writing have changed, and their function has somewhat changed. So I don't think this is wildly important, and to have this kind of archive. As to the question of philanthropy, Jonathan, so early in your archive, there's an interview with George Soros, with Kathleen Foley, in one of the first programs that OSF did, which is the Project on Death in America, which I thought was a fantastic project and very important. And she quotes, I think, Mr. Soros on his hostility to the tyranny of philanthropists, and also that was at a period of time where Mr. Soros talked about the selfless philanthropy, and he had what he called at that time a sunset provision, which meant this was not going to be forever, but it's going to be for a period of time. And the intent, and I understood it, is to give away all of the money that he had to give away in his lifetime. Now that has changed, and his philanthropy has become institutionalized, and there is no sunset provision. Furthermore, by institutionalizing it, over the years, there was a tyranny, and the tyranny became no longer personalized with Mr. Soros himself, but taken over by bureaucracy. So in classic theological fashion, there was a charismatic moment, that's Mr. Soros, and then it became bureaucratized and became ossified. And then it became its own self-justification. And there was, as a result, a huge growth in the, I apologize, I'm alone here, a huge growth in what I would call the bureaucracy of philanthropy. And that bureaucracy of philanthropy is a class of self-appointed do-gooders who are actually not spending their own money. So it's an adjunct of a kind of private property and philanthropy as part of a capitalist economic structure, and now administered by people who act as if it's their money, but it isn't. And there's something peculiar about it, because they act differently from the people who had the original impulse. So what you learn from this archive are several things. First of all, it's not clear to me that private wealth has that much to do with the solution of human problems. In other words, there is something fundamentally wrong about an initiative to help to alleviate human suffering that then is at the whim of someone who just has a lot of money and decides, well, I'm not going to do it anymore. The idea that you intervene in situations where it is the public trust, so the corruption of government or the failure of government or the failure of public entities to do what needs to be done, you somehow compensate for it. What was terrific about the public health program, from my point of view, is the extent to which it did, in the short term, deliver real benefits to people in need, and mobilize a kind of cascading possibility of delivering those benefits, as opposed to people who will fall in love with kind of public policy discussions. So I think it's an extremely good case study on the virtues and deficits of certain kinds of philanthropy. People can take different lessons from it. I happen to believe in very long-term commitments and commitments to structural services to people, whether they be in education or in public health. And yes, political campaigns to change policy, to bring the proper resources to bear, and to eliminate barriers of differential treatment. So, but for myself, what's interesting about the oral history is that it did confirm that the most creative moment in the philanthropy was by Mr. Soros himself at the beginning of the philanthropy, when it was actually refreshing, selfless, unbelievably generous, not suspicious of the recipient, not protecting money or endowments or resources, but really motivated by a desire to change people's lives, and also, as was the case with the fall of communism, to precipitate the opportunity for some progress. So the political consequences of the philanthropy were sometimes extremely welcome, but it was always justified by the aid which it provided to people who had nowhere else to turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Leon. And indeed, this is not the only, but it is one of the few uses of oral history in philanthropy and to capture lessons from philanthropy. And interestingly, one of the other very recent ones was the case of a sunset. You mentioned sunset. When Atlantic Philanthropies decided to sunset, they commissioned an oral history project to capture the sort of inside conversations about that, and in fact retained the very oral history experts who we had the privilege of working with on this project, Thaler Pekar and partners, who are here today, and I'm sure have many, many thoughts that this is bringing up for them about that connection between oral history and philanthropy. And Noor, I wanted to invite you to comment on that. I'm curious whether that's something that you've thought about. You've obviously thought a lot about oral history and critical oral history. Have you thought much about the potential for oral history in the sector of philanthropy in particular?
No, to be honest, not really. But let me offer one or two thoughts. Yeah, and again, I speak from very much a South African perspective, and we've had considerable debate about the place of philanthropy. And of course, there were sort of two phases in philanthropy in South Africa. The one was the proliferation of philanthropy in the struggle against apartheid, and then secondly, in the era of democracy. And it's really very interesting because a number, and I'm not going to mention them here, a number of philanthropic organizations, in fact, played a key role in supporting the development of archives in South Africa. So in that sense, philanthropic organizations have been quite important in allowing the development of independent archives. So I see a sort of mutually, productive relationship in this. So that's the first point. But I also think that it allows for the amplification of some of the critical conversations of actors in movements that are often suppressed and that philanthropic organizations have to hear as well. So that when one speaks to power, it's not only the power of big states, multinational corporations or multilateral organizations, but also it's about uncovering the voices, helping those voices to be amplified, because voices don't need historians to amplify them. They can amplify themselves. They have their own agency, but one can contribute to that. And in that way, ask questions about the role of philanthropy And I think that oral history can play a role in that. And I see in the archive one has some critical reflections about people's experiences, and one hopes that as those critical voices are uncovered and amplified, that the powers that be in the world of philanthropy might hear them more clearly and take them more seriously. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you so much. So just to wrap up, let me ask one quick concluding question for each of Leon and then finally Tamar. Leon, as just curious as Chancellor of the Open Society University Network, whether you might have any thoughts about how the members of this growing diverse network might be able to utilize a resource such as this in scholarship and joint curricular work, etc.
It's hard to guess. I mean, I think that many of the constituents will be interested in the subject matter itself, which is the public health and human rights questions and how they intersect, be interested in the career of this program and the experience that people had in different contexts, whether Belarus or Russia or South Africa or the United States or wherever, or Kyrgyzstan, wherever there was really an investment. I think what your question suggests is that, as has been mentioned, whether or not we ourselves should begin to accumulate an oral history archive of our own, having to do with the Open Society University Network. The difference between the Open Society University Network as something created by private philanthropy is that we would like it to have the characteristics that many universities have, and that is permanence. They're not programs, but they become ongoing and we hope self-renewing organizations that serve different constituencies in different places around the world, but have things they do in common, especially with modern technology and the use of technology in learning and teaching. So, I mean, I think that increasingly, I think this kind of auditory documentation of people's experience and their voices and their agency and however one wants to describe it is going to be increasingly important as we attempt to sort of understand different circumstances and the relation between past and present.
Many thanks. And Tamar, the last word is yours. I just want to ask you, how does it feel? I mean, to kind of come full circle, having been a staff member of the program for so long, and now to be in an academic and clinical position where you might be in a position to use this in teaching. How's that feel?
Thank you so much. It really takes me back to my own journey and my own growth and development. I remember the early days when I first came to Open Society, and I didn't even know very much, and I just knew there was a law and health initiative, and I was like, this is the direction I want to go. And I had really the privilege and opportunity to learn from experts and I would say visionaries, both in terms of the staff of Open Society, but also many of the advocates and grantees and partners that we worked with. And I learned, in depth about fields like palliative care and HIV and harm reduction. And now it's part of who I am and what I do. And so for me, the opportunity to kind of revisit my journey and be back with staff was really, staff and partners was really special and really important. And then also I'm excited about the opportunity to then bring that to others, that others can now learn and have that own development. I remember at some point, Jonathan used to call it an aha moment with health and human rights. You said everybody has their own aha moment at some point with health and human rights. So able to give that to a new generation. And I think the talk about passing the baton very much so. I also left me, hungry for more, because I was like, there are more stories, there are more amazing people. So I'm excited to see what Vit's And I now hearing from Noor, I feel like it's in excellent hands, visionary hands for kind of the next phase. And I also think, OSF is just one part of the story of the development of health and human rights. And so I do really hope that it inspires others that were deeply involved in this work and are also part of the story to contribute their own histories, and there be some vehicle for them to also partner and be part of this. So thank you so much. And also just really nice to have this event, because I know with like COVID and so many changes so rapidly, none of us have felt like this closure. So even just having this event is really wonderful, and this opportunity to reconnect with everyone. So thank you.
Jonathan, I want to thank you too. I'm going to run and thank you both, and Noor, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. And Tamar, picking up on what you just said about OSF being one piece of the larger movement, it's really my pleasure now to turn it over to Professor Sophia Gruskin, who is not only the director of the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at USC, but is also a pioneer of this field in her own right, who also contributed an oral history to this collection, and has offered to say just a few words of thanks to everyone. Sophia, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. And what an incredible panel to follow, I have to say. And thank you, Leon. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Tamar, for lending your expertise and your time to this event. And, I really felt like the panel gave us such a nuanced and powerful way to think about the archive that goes beyond where we've been before. I wanted to say just something quickly about the history of the Oral History Project, at least from my perspective, which is that when Jonathan first approached me with the idea for this project in late 2021, I was totally humbled by the thought of the Institute acting as the steward for such an important collection, but I was also really thrilled at the idea of using oral history to be able to capture the parts of the health and human rights field that most people really don't get to see. I really think the archive is amazing, and I encourage everybody on this call to get familiar with all that it's there. And as great as the archive is now, I think it's fair to say I'm even more excited to see the ways in which the project is going to keep growing in these new directions. The panel was talking about this in January. Our incredible colleagues at WITS are going to be taking on the second phase of the project. And I'm really seeing that they're going to be charting a path for others to contribute and deepen really what's begun here. I do hope the last 90 minutes have begun to give you all a picture of what's already an incredibly diverse archive. There are oral histories from leaders in all aspects of the movement, from palliative care to access to medicines, to harm reduction, to mental health, to law and health, to HIV, and just to name a few. And as someone who thought I knew this field, I've been really excited by all that I've been seeing and all that I've been learning. I also wanted to say, I'm not exactly totally sure how to say this, but in seeing these interviews, I've been really impressed, not just by the expertise, the brilliance, the acuity of our interviewees. I think that probably goes without saying, but also many times their vulnerability, their willingness to share so much of their lives with us, not just their amazing work. And I think that's why at a deep level, folks are going to benefit enormously from each of these histories. And I have to say, since I have the floor of the spotlight, I think you all saw this. I've been blown away by the skills and the professionalism of our student interviewers. Asna, Lily, Mylise, Laura said it in the chat. We originally wanted to include you in this because we wanted students to have an educational experience. But I say this for real. It's we who learned from you about curiosity, about deep listening, about empathy, about partnership, and if I can say, new ways to really think about the craft of storytelling. And it's really the best of what can happen and hope for at a university. And for that, I truly thank you. So before closing, I'd like to do a few thank yous to a few more people who made this project possible. First of all, I have to add another thank you to the Open Society Foundations for making this pilot phase possible and for entrusting us with maintaining this part of George Soros's legacy. To Trevor Nelson and Gilded Cinema, who led the process of capturing these oral histories over video and polishing them for the archive, where they're going to remain permanently housed. To Thaler Pekar and partners who provided incredible expertise in oral history methodology. We really do think this project would not have been possible without their thoughtful guidance. my IIGH colleagues, Laura Ferguson and Summer Pete, who supported Jonathan as project director every step of the way, Michelle Anderson, who was generous with her own expertise in oral history. But I have to take a second to say something about Jonathan, whose vision, whose leadership brought us through every step of this. You're an amazing colleague, you're an amazing friend. I so appreciate not just your brilliance and your work ethic, but your deep humility and engagement, which I think everyone on this call will agree really set the tone for this whole project. So thank you for that. And just to say, our colleagues at the University of Southern California Library System, you've been wonderful in assisting us with preparing the interview recording and transcripts for archiving. And since I'm thanking people, I also want to thank all of you for being on this call with us and taking the time with us to launch this event. Please help us to share the archive with your colleagues and your friends, your channels. I think everyone can benefit from knowing of its existence and engaging. And let me turn it over now to Dr. Kathy Foley to close out our program for today.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And it's really been an honor to be closing this event today. And I think I'll truncate my remarks to try to keep us on time. So I'm Kathy Foley. I was formerly the medical director of the Open Society Foundation's International Palliative Care Initiative, also the former director of the Project on Death in America, and former chair and member of the Public Health Program's Global Health Advisory Committee. So I had this opportunity to really be so involved with so many of the different projects at OSF. And the point I think that's probably most important is that this archive is really a celebration. It's a celebration of the investments of George Soros, the issues he chose to support, the people who he put his money behind, and the incredible and you've heard from so many of them today. And again, to remember that there are so many other people that we would love to be able to have their voices recorded, and hopefully that will happen in the future. There's just an extraordinary history. So the archive, I think you heard a little bit about this from Leon Botstein, is also, George's unique approach to philanthropy. He always believed in trusting in others to lead and letting them to do what they knew how to do. But he did view philanthropy as a tyranny. In that way, he did not want to use an opportunity to tyrannize people. So he really never did tell people what they were to do or how to do it, but really sought out extraordinary experts who he thought could be listened to, who he would be at the forefront of their fields. And he did this when he began our project on Death in America. And he did it for each of the projects. They were led by individuals who really had a clear vision and an expertise to move the field forward in palliative care and harm reduction, in access to medicine and mental health, and on and on. And George also really did believe that the funding could be selfless and should be selfless. And so what is more wonderful than that you don't have to promote your role in the project if it got done. And so he was so willing to accept that we'd receive credit, but he didn't even really care if he received credit. He cared most that what we were doing made a difference. And he would ask, did we do good? Did we help people? Did it make a difference? And so I do think, however, that the public health program never has really taken sufficient credit for the work. And I clearly hope that this archive is going to do something meaningful to change that, because they're just extraordinary impact on public health in so many different dimensions. And finally, George argued that if you were funding people and you didn't have failures, then you weren't funding the right people. And so I think this was also quite extraordinary. And clearly in this archive, there are some stories of failures, but there are so many more stories of successes. And they're worth watching and they're worth listening. And I think what is, better than an open society to be able to acknowledge that we failed at some things, but tried, and we were so successful at others. So not only were these successful stories, they were extraordinary wins. And, you'll hear these in the stories that are being told. And this is what the wisdom of oral history holds. It's a rare look behind the scenes, and it makes it feel as if you were the viewer, that you know the story that few others told, that you know the dominant narrative. And this is the dominant narrative in contrast to others that are being told. So thank you everyone for today. I'm going now to hand this back to Jonathan, who will leave us with the last few minutes for questions. So thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kathy. And to conclude this event, I simply want to ask Summer to move us into the grid view so that you can all see who's here. You can see your friends, you can see your former colleagues, your grantees. I invite you just to scroll through that, to look at the participant list, to look at the chat. And while we have that moment with each other, I encourage you to unmute yourself, say a few words. If you want to use the raise hand function or put hand in the chat, we can do it that way. But this last few minutes is just for you.
Is Wolfgang on the phone, Jonathan?
Wolfgang, are you here? I don't think so.
Don't think so.
Sharon Vaughn had her hand up.
Hi, Sharon. Over to you.
I was just clapping. It's not a hand up.
Oh. Well, I agree with Sharon that technology can help this too. The predictive analytics can look at every one of your stories that succeeded and every one that failed and give you number predictions as to why and how to keep expanding and sustaining investors in your global investment in our future together.
Thank you for that. I believe was that Lynn?
Yes.
Thank you, Lynn.
Maybe we can go to Alan?
Alan.
Hi, just to say it's exciting to see so many friendly faces here. So Jonathan and Sophia, I hope there's a phase 2 that is bringing us together physically. They are good fundraisers in this group, so that's the next challenge. Over to you, but really, really lovely to see old friends, allies, and people who we've been in the struggle together.
Thank you, Alan. So here's the QR code, which you can hold up your camera to and browse the archive. And we have 1 more minute left if anyone else would like to share anything. We have present many of the people who were interviewed, many former staff of the program. Anyone else want to come in?
May I say something, Dr. Cohen? My hand is not working.
Please.
Yes, I just want to thank everyone, the panelists and student interviewers. I've learned a lot listening, and this has been a fantastic experience and a great way to end the fall semester.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add that even though I put it in the chat, but even though I have so many years of PhD experience, really looking forward to hearing the grantees and the reflections of colleagues, because in fact, we didn't have that much time to really interrogate each other's thinking or hear what people's experiences were at the time. So yeah, I know that history is not just for the personal benefit of those who were participating, but it is also that, and I'm looking forward to spending time in the archive, and grateful to you for putting it together.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, it was a labor of love, as you can see, and it's just the beginning. And if nothing else, it has brought this extraordinary group together. So we really want to thank you all on behalf of everyone. I really want to recognize Summer Pete and Michelle Chow, who designed and organized this extraordinary launch event with us. So if you could all just join me in thanking them for this amazing launch. Thank you so much for your hard work and the beautiful results, and looking forward to engaging with our history together. Have a wonderful day, everybody.